Welcome to everyone to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Over the course of the next 45 to 60 minutes, we will be looking at how to navigate a cyber attack and some of the key crisis management principles to deploy in the event of such an incident. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help organizations through crisis management planning, training and exercising to do and say the right things on the worst days of their business lives. And these days, I think certainly a cyber incident is indeed one of those worst things that can possibly happen. This is from PwC's most recent annual global CEO survey, and you will see that right up there among the top 10 of things that are of extreme concern to CEOs around the world are cyber threats, with 33% of CEOs saying that cyber threats are of extreme concern. And I don't think that is a surprise. The fact that we have a bumper attendance for this webinar suggests that this is a topic of significant interest and significant concern. And I guess the reason for that is we have seen many organizations suffer a cyber incident. Some handle them very effectively, but some less so. And what we can see from some of these examples here is that if you get it wrong, the cost of getting it wrong is significant in terms of the value of the business, the physical cost of responding to a situation, the fines that can be levied, and indeed jobs that can be lost, sometimes at the very most senior levels, plus of course all of the loss of reputation and trust which can occur with customers and other stakeholders who have been affected by your cyber incident. As we look at this slide and the kind of organizations who have suffered from cyber incidents, it's clear that there are some very large and successful organizations there run by smart, intelligent, successful business people. And so I guess the question to ask is, why do such smart and intelligent people from such successful organizations make mistakes when responding to a cyber incident? Well, here I think are some of the reasons. A crisis of any kind, and certainly a cyber incident, is by any means an extraordinary challenge. It's a time of severe uncertainty. You won't know exactly what is going on for a very, very long time, not on the first day, not by the end of the first week. It can take months. Sometimes you never know exactly what was going on with regard to a cyber incident. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's time pressure. You know that you need to communicate pretty quickly. It may even be that news of your breach is out there on social media already. And so you are under severe time pressure to communicate, if for no other reason than regulators in the UK, the ICO, have a time limit within which you must communicate. So you're operating under significant time pressure. And of course, the stakes are very high. We've seen from that previous slide that the cost in all of its various forms of a cyber incident can be very, very high. And you need to deal with the incident at this time of uncertainty, time pressure and high stakes, despite the fact that when the moment comes, you may find that you have inadequate plans or ways of working. You don't have enough resource. You're not able to respond in the way that you want simply because you don't have all of the necessary resources. You may lack the skills that you need, and or you may lack practice. Let's hope this isn't your fourth or fifth cyber incident, so maybe it's not a surprise that you lack practice. But the combination of those two things, that really, really intense pressure and challenge, combined with a framework, a set of skills, capabilities, which maybe are not quite up to the task, starts to explain why successful people within highly respected organizations sometimes get their response to a cyber incident wrong. So what we're going to do over the next 45 to 50 minutes is take an in-depth look at a couple of case studies of organizations which have suffered cyber incidents over the last 12 months, take a look at how they responded and what we can learn from that, and then finish off with some principles and some next steps to help you prepare to be ready should the worst happen. I would encourage you to ask any questions via the chat or question pane within your control panel, and we hope to have 5 to 15 minutes at the end to deal with a number of those questions. So the two case studies that we're going to look at are Travelex and Norsk Hydro. Now, for those of you who are not aware of Travelex, Travelex is a foreign exchange company, one of the probably the most famous travel exchange company, certainly operating in the UK. It's present in many airports, on high streets, and of course online. So what happened? Well, on the 31st of December 2019, Travelex was hit by what it called at that time a software virus, and that brought down its operations across multiple countries. Customers going onto its website simply saw an error message at first, and for the next 2 days, their online services remained unavailable with that error message showing. It was not just the public-facing transactional website that was affected, it was also banks who were using Travelex to provide foreign exchange services. So many of the UK's biggest banks, Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays and HSBC, for example, were also affected. And right until the beginning of February, in the end, those banks were unable to access their normal Travelex systems. So what Travelex did was it took all of those systems offline to try and contain and resolve the issues. That meant that the only way that they could service customers in its branches, for example in the airports, was to use the old-fashioned method of pen and paper. And if you can imagine, this is absolutely a business which is based on technology. To have to actually service your clients using pen and paper is an extraordinary challenge. Now, a week later, on the 6th of January, it became clear that the issue was actually caused by a cyber attack. The word cyber attack or even cyber incident had not been used to that point. It was an attack by a cyber criminal gang known as Sodinokibi. I apologize if that is incorrect pronunciation. The gang were asking for $6 million in order to decrypt Travelex's data and restore their systems. Travelex repeated that no customer data had been lost during the attack, but the attackers, at the same time that Travelex were saying that, claimed that in fact they had stolen 5 gigabytes of user data from the Travelex networks, including dates of birth, credit card information, and national insurance numbers. And they claimed to have had access to the system 6 months ahead of the actual revelation of the attack. It took Travelex until the 8th of January, so we're now talking 9 days after they initially became aware of it, to confirm that this was a cyber attack. Not only was that not confirmed broadly externally until the 8th of January, they hadn't contacted the ICO ahead of that on the basis that they believed that no customer data had been breached. It took 2 weeks for the IT system used by their own staff in store to be restored, and as previously mentioned, it took even longer for systems to be restored within the banks that used Travelex's systems. So that was effectively what happened. They were the key events. I'd now like to look at how Travelex responded in a little bit more detail. And this obviously is a perspective from outside of the organisation. It's always very easy to be an armchair critic. I know that only too well. But hopefully by looking at and learning from what Travelex did, we can help to make sure that our own organisations are more resilient and better able to respond. I think it is clear to me to say that Travelex were slow to respond to this crisis. Their first communication, even that its services were offline, took them 3 days. That's a long time when it is immediately obvious to the outside world that your services are offline, because when they log on to your website, it's not there. So to fail to communicate for a period of, 2 days, not 3 days, but to fail to communicate for 2 whole days is not the smartest of moves. They initially communicated that fact via a statement on Twitter. Their next communication came on the 8th of January, 6 days later. So 8 days into the crisis, we have only had 2 pieces of communication from Travelex. When you've got thousands of customers and other stakeholders who are concerned and confused about what's going on and worried that their own data may have been compromised, to only issue 2 relatively terse communications within 8 days, I would strongly suggest is insufficient. There was also a lack of total transparency and straightforwardness. In those early days, Travelex said that its website was down for planned maintenance, which clearly ultimately wasn't the case. And as a broader point, whenever you communicate something in a crisis which proves subsequently not to be true, you really harm your credibility and your ability to make future statements which will be believed as definitively true. So make sure that anything that you say absolutely and definitively is true. It took Travelex's CEO, Tony D'Souza, 17 days to comment, and this image on this slide is a screen grab from his video which he posted. It's about a 2-minute video. After this webinar, I'll send you a link to my LinkedIn post about the video. But I think whilst the idea of a CEO statement via a video is a good one, to do it 17 days after the event, again, is incredibly slow. There were also issues with the content and tone of voice and style of the video. The first thing that Tony D'Souza says is that this is the first opportunity I've had to speak with you. That clearly wasn't true. And again, it's just important that whatever your spokespeople say needs to be credible, believable, and to be accepted by stakeholders. It clearly wasn't his first opportunity to speak. He didn't apologize at first as part of this video. His performance was quite wooden. It was clear he was reading from an auto cue, and as you will all know, authenticity and empathy and humanity in a crisis is so important when your stakeholders have been potentially impacted or harmed by what your organization has done. And so coming across in a more natural way would have been beneficial. And also location. They say that pictures are worth 1,000 words, and you can see from this image, it looks like the CEO is being filmed either in a hotel conference room or potentially within a boardroom. Maybe an image with him within the control center with people behind, working flat out to put the problem right. Something that positioned him as being in the front line of putting the problem right might have been more appropriate. So that's some of the considerations in terms of their external communication response. At least as important in a cyber incident, and indeed any crisis, is your internal communications, what you say to your employees, your colleagues, your staff. The two questions that employees always ask in the event of a crisis are, is the senior team competent to get us through this crisis? And do they care? Do they care about us? Do they care about our stakeholders? So are they competent and do they care? Travelex's employees were scathing, frankly, in their comments about the Travelex leadership's response to the situation. Quoted anonymously on the BBC website, here are 2 or 3 quotes from Travelex employees. One said, "I work for Travelex, and low down in the ranks we have no clue as to what is happening. We are as frustrated and upset as the customers are." A second one said, "I couldn't help but laugh at the idea that the public response has been shockingly bad. It's nothing compared to how it's been handled internally. It feels like there is distinct lack of real leadership and communication." Another employee said, "Our response seemed to be a masterclass in what not to do." In a crisis, your employees can be your best ambassadors or your biggest critics. And I think it's clear from those comments from Travelex employees which category their staff members fell into. It's really important to communicate early, fully, and clearly with your staff to bring them on board, to make them part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think that was one of the critical areas that Travelex struggled with. In impact, this situation had a significant financial, operational, and reputational impact. Clearly, it's too early right now to evaluate the full extent of the impact, but to be without your key website for a month or more, if we think about the banks having their systems down, clearly that is going to have a huge operational impact. It's going to have a huge financial impact in terms of sales, and that is also reflected by the fact that Travelex's parent company dropped by over 20%, its value dropped by over 20% in the 2 weeks after the attack, and also that S&P Global Ratings issued a warning about Travelex's finances and its creditworthiness as a standalone business. So there are some very real short-term costs there. I think it's undeniable that there has been a reputational impact. The question now is whether Travelex can recover any damage that has been done, or whether this turns into a long and painful saga. So that's the first example, Travelex. Key learnings more broadly. What can we take out of this situation, and how can we use it to help us prepare and respond more effectively? Prepare, really, as you can see, is the key word. It appears to me that Travelex's response was not well planned, that their plans and their training and their rehearsals either didn't exist, or if they did, they were inadequate to get it to do and say the right things. On that most awful day, just after Christmas, just before New Year, they failed to enable them to deliver a pitch-perfect crisis management response. So make sure that you have done your preparation in terms of planning, training and exercising in peacetime, so that if and when that worst day comes, you are ready, right ready to do and say the right things. And in Travelex's case, and again where I think we can learn, communication was a real issue. Successful crisis management is about two things happening in parallel. One, addressing the underlying problem that the crisis is founded upon, and two, at the same time, communicating with your stakeholders really effectively to retain their trust and confidence. Quick, transparent, and prolific communication is required in order to achieve that. And a final point on communication. In any crisis, you will have multiple stakeholders, but there are usually one or two who will be more impacted by a particular situation and or more influential in terms of whether or not you will recover from the situation. If you can identify in any crisis who your top 2 or 3 stakeholder groups are, and if you get the communication right with them, you will be at least 3/4 of the way towards a successful crisis response. In this case, employee and customer communication were critical and were two of the areas in which it appears that Travelex fell down. And frankly, in many cyber incidents, employee and customer communication are top priorities. So that's our first case. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or observations, please do post them. I'm now going to move on to Norsk Hydro. Norsk Hydro are a Norwegian aluminium company. Indeed, they are one of the world's largest aluminium companies with operations around the world. In the early hours of March the 19th, 2019, just under 12 months ago, they were hit by a major cyber attack. A virus locked files on thousands of servers and PCs. Both production and office staff were affected. And a ransom demand was posted on the screens of affected computers, and you can see it here. All of that damage had been set in motion 3 months beforehand, when, as is often the case, one employee unknowingly opened an infected email, supposedly from a trusted customer, and it was by clicking on that link that allowed hackers to invade the IT infrastructure and covertly plant their virus 3 months before. So, how did Novo Nordisk respond? Well, as I mentioned, the situation broke at 4 a.m. in the morning. That's when anybody who was up at 4 a.m. in the morning, and of course as a global company there were people who were up at 4 a.m. in the morning somewhere in the world. When that happened, the really good news was that Norsk Hydro's crisis management team was activated. So the people in different time zones who were seeing this message first knew who to call in the event of an incident, and that activated the Norway-based head office and strategic crisis management team, despite the fact that it was 4 a.m. in the morning in Europe. Their corporate information security officer said he immediately phoned the company's emergency preparedness chief to organize an urgent meeting later that morning. This clearly was a company crisis, he said. Before moving on, I just ask you to have a think. How confident are you that your activation process would enable the right people to be notified almost immediately wherever in the world the crisis happens, at whatever time? This response by Norsk Hydro clearly signifies that they had done their planning beforehand, so they were able to activate their team despite it being the early hours of the morning in Europe. At that first meeting, which of course was for some at least a virtual meeting, calling in by phone, they made two key decisions which underpinned everything they did in their response. Firstly, they decided they would not pay any ransom. There are rumours, by the way, that Travelex did pay a ransom. Travelex have not confirmed that, but there are rumours that they did in fact pay the ransom. Norsk Hydro definitively decided we will not pay any ransom. And their second decision was that they would be completely open about the breach. Why did they decide not to pay any ransom? Well, to quote the CIO, Jo de Vliega, she said, "I think in general it's a very bad idea to pay. It fuels an industry and it's probably financing other sorts of crime. It goes against our company values." One can argue about whether it's a good or bad idea, but the thing that stands out there for me is the thing about values. In general, across all crisis types, it's important to respond to the crisis in a way which represents your values. Let your values guide your crisis response. And the fact that paying a ransom would have gone against those company values was a key reason why they decided not to pay any ransom. They also used a nice phrase, which is another reason why they didn't pay the ransom: don't feed the birds, they will keep coming back. So if you pay a ransom once, then the bad guys will know that you pay ransoms and come back asking for more. So it is not necessarily the end of your problems. Why did they make the decision to be completely open about the breach? Well, again, it came back to culture and values. As Halvor Molland, Senior Vice President of Media Relations, said, transparency is core to the Norsk Hydro culture. We wanted to help other industries learn from our experience, and I'm delighted to be able to help them in that quest today. But again, it's important to reflect on the fact of what are the values at your organization? What's the culture at your organization? Would your leadership team be courageous enough to be true to those values and that culture in a crisis? If you are, and they do, then there's every likelihood that you will emerge with your reputation intact. If the organization becomes expedient or pragmatic, that's when real harm can be done, and values and culture become exposed as something of a sham. They are only skin deep. How did they continue to operate from a practical point of view, facing the same kinds of challenges, but perhaps even bigger than Travelex? Because not only were their office systems down, their heavy machinery and their production processes were also controlled by computers. And as Halvor Molland said, if power is lost in an uncontrolled manner, it could risk severe safety incidents for people. Safety is always first priority with us. Secondly, it's the concern for the environment and ensuring we don't have any uncontrolled emissions. So how did they operate in the absence of their normal systems? Well, the entire workforce did their jobs with pen and paper. So ultimately, in your scenario planning, think about how you would operate without your normal IT infrastructure. What Norsk Hydro also did is they invited back into the business some retired employees who were more used to working with pens and papers, some of the old guys who knew exactly how things worked without having a computer, and they actually collaborated and supported with existing employees to get them through with a more manual way of operating. I wanted now to take a deeper dive into their communication response, because it's really interesting. So I mentioned earlier that at a strategic level within the crisis management team itself, they made that decision to be completely open about the breach. And there's a great YouTube video which you can see a screen grab of in the bottom right hand corner of this slide, whereby Inga Sethoff, Head of Communications and Public Affairs, describes why they chose to be so transparent during a cyber attack. And she explains how communication was based on two principles: transparency and frequency. She describes it as extreme transparency. She also made specific reference to the importance of internal communication, which we saw was a challenge for Travelex. She said, how do you enable your employees to act in a way that limits the operational and financial impact? By getting them on board and making sure they know the risks. So they were very open, they were very prolific, both externally but also internally. Internally, the aim was to very, very much make employees advocates and leaders of the solution. Another interesting internal communications challenge that you might like to wrestle with yourselves as you consider how you might respond to such an incident is, how did they communicate the initial message for employees not to log on to PCs? How did they get that message out to 35,000 employees in 40 countries without any of their normal systems on that first day when it broke at 4 a.m.? They hadn't scenario planned that in advance, and it is something I would commend you to think about, but they were very creative. What they did was that executives, members of the crisis management team, hand wrote signs warning of the cyber attack. They photographed them with their smartphones and sent them via WhatsApp to managers around the world. Those managers then used local printing shops to make paper signs out of those photographs, which they then posted onto doors, entryways, stairwells and elevators for employees to read as they arrived for their apparently normal working day. So sometimes the skill or attribute of creativity is underutilized in a crisis, but actually you need some creative people in a crisis to come up with a solution like that, which isn't the normal way of doing things, but is a good solution under the unique pressures of a crisis. On the external side, they had no website. The website was also affected by this breach. And so they used Facebook initially to communicate with the outside world. So again, have a think, how would you communicate to the outside world in the absence of your website? So you'll recall that their principles for communication were transparency and frequency. How did they manifest that? Well, they issued 2 statements on day 1, and then they communicated regularly throughout the situation. There was, for the first 2 weeks, there was on average a statement every day, and you can still find them on the Norsk Hydro website, and you will see there are 2 pages of statements. They came out very, very regularly. And within those statements, they provided clear and detailed information. They communicated as much as they possibly could. They held daily press conferences at the Oslo HQ. You can see senior managers presenting at one of those press conferences on the picture top left. They did daily internal briefings. So again, staff were kept constantly updated. They did the counterintuitive thing, which was to, rather than viewing the media as being a threat to be kept at arm's length, they opened the doors to the media. Journalists were invited into the business to go behind the scenes, even into the control rooms where the crisis was being managed. And in a very smart move, Norsk Hydro invited them to meet what they called their cyber heroes, the real people who were fighting this battle against the criminals to get the business up and running again. It's a really smart move to humanize Norsk Hydro's response, to give them a different story to write about, and actually to make it one of heroism and human triumph against adversity, rather than the story of an organization under attack and failing. They posted to Facebook and Twitter regularly, and you heard I mentioned their website was unavailable. They actually brought forward the launch of a completely new website significantly, and had a new website up and running within 2 or 3 days. They recognized that they needed that outward facing platform to communicate with the media and other stakeholders, and so getting that public face up and running as quickly as possible was critical. I should mention, and there will be a link to it in the email that follows this this webinar. There is a very good case study of how Norsk Hydro responded. It's on the Microsoft website, because Microsoft helped them with their technical response, but I'll put a link to that within the follow-up email, and it's well worth having a look at. So in terms of impact, yes, the cost, the hard cost of dealing with this incident has been confirmed by Norsk Hydro as being $75 million. So I think there's little doubt that any significant cyber attack is going to cost you money in the short term. However, as this article says, what they did protect was their long-term reputation. And interestingly, in the aftermath of the incident, their share price went up. So the value of the business increased. And Inga Sethoff, the head of comms and public affairs, is quoted as saying, external stakeholders appreciated the transparency and openness, and that was how we retained their trust and their confidence. So that is the second example, the Norsk Hydro. Here are some of the key learnings for you to consider as you plan and potentially face a cyber incident. And as I go through these, I would remind you to submit any questions, which we'll try and deal with in the final 5 to 10 minutes. So, learnings from Norsk Hydro. Taking control quickly gives you greater influence over your ultimate destiny. You know, what you do and say in the first few hours, certainly the first day of a crisis, is a key predictor of how successful you will be in managing the crisis overall. So the fact that they moved swiftly and effectively very soon after having been alerted of the incident meant that they were able to influence where they ended up. Frequent and transparent communication helps to retain trust and reputation. Norsk Hydro were prolific in their communication. They provided all sorts of access, they provided all sorts of interviewees, they provided all sorts of photo opportunities, they provided all sorts of information. Therefore, the media had plenty to work with. That's not to say they didn't go to other people for comment and their views, but the Norsk Hydro perspective and their view of the situation was the dominant part of the story. It's the old adage of filling the information vacuum. The third learning, I think, is the importance of clear principles to guide crisis response. You'll recall we talked about the decision not to pay a ransom and the decision to be transparent and frequent in their communication. If very early on, as a senior crisis management team, you determine and agree what those principles that underpin your response are going to be, it makes all subsequent decision making and planning so much easier, because you can bring everything back to Does this fit in with the principles that we've agreed on? Be guided by your values. You heard in a number of the quotes that I gave to you from senior Norsk Hydro personnel, a lot of the way that they responded was guided by their values. And again, I've mentioned it a couple of times earlier on, but do reflect upon what the values and culture of your organization mean in terms of how you should and how your stakeholders would expect you to respond to a crisis. If you respond in a way that is counter to those values, you risk doing yourself untold damage. The role of creativity in a crisis, I mentioned that with regards to getting those notices out and on walls ahead of staff arriving for their normal day's work. The potential for opportunity out of crisis, and in particular, this idea of crisis as an extreme team building exercise, which was a phrase used again by one of Norsk Hydro's senior managers. No one wants a crisis, no one welcomes a crisis, but managed right, you can actually create significant opportunity out of a crisis. It can be, a real galvanizing force for an organization. It can also create new and better ways of working that can be carried forward into business as usual. So those are the two cases. Some broader thinking before, as I say, hopefully we will, should have at least 5 minutes for questions. So some broader implications for crisis management planning. Firstly, in advance of the crisis, I would advise you to set your strategic framework for your cyber crisis response. You know that this could happen, so why not ahead of the situation determine some of these key strategic elements? First of all, what is your strategic intent? What do I mean by that? What I mean is, what are the key strategic principles, the end goal, which will guide your decisions and actions in a crisis? So as a simple example, if your end goal is to protect the interests of customers at all costs, then that will help to guide everything else you do during a crisis. Beware of having multiple objectives. So, for example, protect the best interests of customers and minimize the operational impact on the business. Those two objectives are probably in conflict with each other. So you either need to kind of have one, or you as a minimum need to have them in priority order so that the one at the top will trump one lower down on the list. Otherwise, actually, they're not that much help at all. What are the implications of your values? Talked about that already. What principles will underpin your response? And what decisions can you make now? By now, I mean ahead of the crisis. So you can, in all of your businesses, make a decision in principle now as to whether or not you would pay a ransom demand. There are other in principle decisions that you could make now. As those of you who've been involved in a crisis will know, time is tight in a crisis, emotions are running high, there's that enormous pressure. Why not have some of those critical conversations about decisions when you're not in that pressure cooker, rather than trying to make cool, rational, sensible, strategic, thoughtful decisions when actually you're in the worst possible emotional state to make those decisions. So there are some strategic considerations for you ahead of a crisis. We saw that the communication response was particularly important for Norsk Hydro. So why not scenario plan your own communication response to a cyber incident to avoid discovering holes, flaws, gaps, inconsistencies when the crisis happens? So a whole series of questions here. This presentation will be available on the website after this, but I'll quickly run through it now. Simply, who are your stakeholders in the event of a cyber incident? How would you reach them? Do you understand their expectations or requirements? Requirements could be what the regulator demands. Expectations could be what your customers could reasonably expect from you. What are your in-principle messages? When would you notify customers? Which customers? Current customers? All former customers? How would you do that? Who's responsible for it? When would you notify staff? How? Where will stakeholders go for information? How can you meet this demand? So in other words, if you were one of your customers, where would you turn to for information? Think that through beforehand so that wherever that place is, you can make sure that the right information gets there. So for example, the website is a very obvious place people will turn to for information, as is social media. So per the next 2 bullet points, how would you use social media and your website? How would you get information there? Call center is another example for kind of consumer-facing organizations. Your call center is going to be under siege, so how are you going to plan for that? Critically, you've seen that for both Travelex and Norsk Hydro, communicating via their normal channels was difficult. How will you communicate if your normal channels are unavailable? And a crisis will probably demand anything from 10 to 100 times more communication resource than a normal day. So how can you quickly upweight your communication capability and function in the event of a crisis taking place? So some of the questions that I suggest you need to be asking yourself and answering in advance of the incident in order to be able to respond really effectively. Develop a cyber incident response plan. It is critical to have a simple, clear, straightforward, well-structured plan for your team to follow in the event of a crisis occurring. You heard in the Norsk Hydro example that, for example, their activation process worked like clockwork. That isn't always the case. So have a plan that would support your response to a situation like a cyber incident. Base it on your strategic framework that we touched on earlier. It should be informed by your scenario planning. So there may be 3 or 4 critical types of cyber incidents that you are planning for, and you may well want to have checklists against those specific different incident types. The fundamental principles of how you work and operate in a crisis should always be the same. But as I say, if there are nuances between different kinds of incidents, having a 1, maximum 2-page checklist of these are the first 20 things I need to do in response to this kind of crisis can be very, very useful. And if you are going to communicate quickly, prolifically and transparently, you will need resources to help you do that. So either as a separate crisis communication plan or as part of your cyber incident response plan, your principles for communication. You know, is it frequently and transparently? Your message themes, you can pre-prepare some of the message themes, if not the precise words themselves. And those templated materials to give you a head start in a crisis, they'll need to be reviewed and additional information added. But if you can save 20 minutes in the first couple of hours of a crisis, that's a massive head start. Stakeholder lists and contact details, make sure you know who those stakeholders are, make sure you know how to reach them. Communications planning framework, a way of organizing your stakeholder engagement. And you know, it seems very rudimentary, but a clear and an agreed approval process so that you can get information out there quickly. We're entering into the last 10 minutes of the session, so any last questions, please put them through now. We're going into the last couple of slides. Having put your plan into place, I would encourage you to train, rehearse, learn and improve. A cyber incident could very well be the most challenging, the most pivotal event in your company's history for the last decade, maybe longer. You have to have rehearsed your response ahead of that happening if you are to have the very best chance of protecting your reputation and retaining the trust of your stakeholders. Yes, it takes a lot of time out of an executive's day. Yes, it may cost a few pounds to run it, and it will require, you know, time to plan for it. But it is the only way of generating the capability and the confidence ultimately to deliver a pitch perfect response. I would also emphasize learn and improve. If you have near misses, if you see competitors or even not competitors suffering from cyber incidents, you know, get a group of people around the table, discuss what happened and have a chat about how would we have responded to that? What can we learn from what they did? It's what we're doing this lunchtime, but it's something that you could also do within your own organizations. So I can't finish a webinar without showing my favorite Oxford Metrica slide. This shows the value impact of a crisis, including cyber incidents, on organizations. And what it shows in simple terms is what you do in the first day or two of a crisis has a significant impact on where you end up a year later. Do the wrong things and your journey to the bottom of this chart can be rapid and deep. If you do the right things in the first couple of days, you will have an initial glitch, an initial drop in value, but you will quickly recover, and that's represented by the blue line. And it will be interesting to watch what happens to Travelex and Norsk Hydro over the coming months to see where their journey is going to. So I'm now going to take a look at the questions and aim to address some of those. So first question, what advice would you give to the communications departments, perhaps wanting to be open and transparent, but wrestling with legal and investor relations departments, advising the management board to keep quiet when trying to track down cyber criminals? So this, I think, this comes down to what you do beforehand. This is where you need to sit down with your colleagues ahead of the crisis and have those in principle discussions to avoid having heated discussions and or conflicts during the crisis itself. You may have further heated conversations during the crisis, but to at least have agreed in principle how we will respond is really helpful, because then those principles have to be challenged if they are going to be overturned. What this person is also asking is, you know, what about if law enforcement agencies are advising you to keep your head down? My advice there would be, my bottom line advice would be, it is your reputation that is at stake. It is your business which is at stake. You need to do what is in the best interests of your business and your reputation. And sometimes the interests of the law enforcement agencies do not necessarily align with your objectives or best interests. They may or they may not. Bottom line is, I suggest you should do what is in your own best interests. So we are now just 3 minutes from the end of the webinar. If I haven't covered your question, please do feel free to email me afterwards. I wanted to spend the last 3 minutes just mentioning a couple of upcoming events which you may be interested in. Given that you're attending this session, you are clearly crisis management aficionados. I will be presenting at the Crisis Minds conference in London next week. I think that's next Wednesday. Again, in the follow-up to this webinar, I will include a link to the Crisis Minds website for senior in-house professionals with an interest in crisis management, you can register and attend that event free. It's not just me speaking, there will be lots of other very interesting speakers there too. So if you're free next Wednesday and would like to attend, there'll be a link to do so. Our next webinar will be on the 1st of April. It's not an April Fool's joke. It's real. It's happening. And that will be really an analysis of what I and we have learned over the last 25 years of the most predictable mistakes that crisis management teams make and how to avoid them. We will be running an open crisis management exercise at the Churchill War Rooms, London, on the 11th of June. So invitations for that will be going out in a month or two's time. And just to make you aware that I am in the finishing stages of writing a book. It's a book which is not romantic fiction, but a crisis management book. It's aimed at people within organizations who are responsible for crisis management, to kind of give them the insider's tips on what you need to know and do to make sure that your organization is really well prepared for a crisis. There will be a book launch event in September, so more details nearer the time. I'd also like to remind any of you that haven't yet taken our crisis readiness scorecard, go to our website. It's on the homepage, and it's a nice, insightful questionnaire which generates a bespoke report which will identify where you are strong and where there may be areas that could do with enhancement. So please feel free to have a look at that. So with 1 minute to spare, that brings us to the end of this particular webinar. I hope that you found it insightful and interesting. As I say, if you have any comments or questions, do please email me. There will be a follow-up email, as I say, with a variety of links to useful information. If we're not already working with you as a client and you would like any assistance, of course, we would be delighted to help. What we're all about is preventing the damage that's caused not just to organizations, but also to their stakeholders in the event of a crisis. So please do drop me a line if we can be of assistance. Thank you all so much for joining us over the last hour, and I wish you a pleasant and a crisis-free afternoon. Thank you very much.